The night was supposed to be routine. A charity gala, polite applause, donors sipping cocktails. Instead, it turned into one of the most volatile evenings of Elvis Presley's life. When he walked onto the stage, he was met not with cheers but with jeers. Veterans glared, protesters outside called him a sellout, and even the microphone carried the sting of insults hurled from the crowd. For a moment, it seemed the king was finished. But then something happened no one could have scripted. He stopped the show, silenced the band, and sang a song that wasn't on the program, alone, unaccompanied, vulnerable. The audience froze. Moments later, a decorated veteran rose from his seat, limped to the stage, and placed his medal in Elvis's hand. By the end of the night, the boos had vanished, replaced by tears, standing ovations, and headlines that would echo for decades. It was not Vegas, not Hollywood, not fame. It was the night Elvis turned contempt into redemption and proved that even a broken voice could heal a divided room. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The evening began long before the curtain would rise. The ballroom of the old Civic Center was dressed in banners that tried to look festive but carried the faint smell of desperation. This was not Las Vegas, nor the glory of Madison Square Garden. This was a charity gala organized by local businessmen and veterans associations, meant to raise money for hospitals. To make it shine, they needed a name that people would still pay attention to. They had chosen Elvis Presley. The irony was not lost on the organizers. For some of them, Presley was a legend, the man who had changed music and carried America into a new cultural age. For others, he was a relic, an echo of a decade they would rather forget. The country had changed since the days when girls fainted at the sound of his voice. Soldiers had gone to Vietnam and come back broken, or never come back at all. The civil rights struggle had torn towns apart, and in the middle of it all, Elvis had been safe, filming movies in Hollywood, wearing sequined costumes on stage. To some of the veterans now sitting at the round tables, that was unforgivable. Backstage, the tension felt like smoke. Organizers whispered near the hallway doors, their voices sharp with nervousness. One of them stormed into the green room and muttered, "3 bands pulled out. They say they won't share a stage with him, said it's not worth it." Another answered, "They'll regret it if he draws money." But no one sounded convinced. Elvis sat quietly at the dressing table, staring at his reflection under the buzzing fluorescent lights. His hair was perfect, his suit pressed, but his eyes betrayed a man measuring the room without leaving his chair. He had been here before, in other ways. Rooms where half the people wanted him to fail, where expectations were knives sharpened behind smiles. Tonight was worse. This wasn't just a show. It was supposed to be a noble cause, and yet he could already sense the hostility waiting for him out there. A young assistant rushed in, carrying a stack of notes. "Mr. Presley, the crowd's mixed. Some are excited, some not so much." He hesitated before adding, "There are signs outside, protesters. They're calling you a sellout." Elvis didn't flinch, though his jaw tightened. He knew the phrase well. Sold out. He had heard it whispered in the late 60s when he chose Las Vegas over political rallies, when he kept his music clean while the world shouted for protest songs. They wanted him to be someone else, someone angrier, someone louder. But that wasn't who he was. He rose slowly and walked toward the side curtain. Through the narrow opening he could see the hall. The audience was restless even before the lights dimmed. Some sipped at their drinks too quickly, avoiding eye contact. Others sat stiff, waiting to be unimpressed. At one table near the front, a man in a worn army jacket leaned heavily on his crutch. His left pant leg was neatly pinned up where a limb should have been. He looked no older than 30. Elvis paused, watching him longer than he meant to. That single figure seemed to silence the noise in his head. He thought of his own military service, a few years stationed in Germany, where the most dangerous weapon he faced was boredom. He had never bled in the jungle, never lost a brother in a rice paddy. Men like that young veteran had, and they were the ones who had the right to judge him tonight. Behind him, an organizer whispered angrily to another, "If this flops, the donors walk. The hospital loses everything." Why couldn't he just stick to the program? The words carried clearly enough for Elvis to hear. He straightened, running a hand along the microphone stand set for him. His heartbeat was steady, but inside, a conflict churned. Should he try to win them over with a polished show, the practiced Vegas spectacle? Or should he risk being raw, letting them see the man behind the rhinestones? The crowd's low hum seemed to grow heavier, as though the room itself expected him to fail. Even before his first step onto the stage, the atmosphere was already a trial. Elvis turned back for a final glance at the mirror in the dressing room. The face staring back was familiar, but not youthful anymore. The lines around his eyes carried years of expectation, fame, and silence. He adjusted his collar, exhaled slowly, and let the thought of the veteran in the front row settle deep inside him. That man was watching. That man deserved something more than a performance. The announcement echoed through the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, Elvis Presley." The murmur of the crowd didn't rise. It didn't soften. It hung like a verdict waiting to be delivered. And with that, he stepped into the light. The spotlight burned hot as it found him. For a second, the crowd seemed suspended between curiosity and resistance. Then, instead of the expected applause, a restless murmur rolled across the hall. A chair scraped. Someone coughed too loudly. From the back corner came a sharp voice. "Go back to Hollywood." The words were ugly, not in volume, but in intent. They cut across the room with the precision of a blade. Elvis shifted his weight, the guitar strap pressing against his shoulder. He gave no outward reaction. The years had taught him how to withstand mockery, though never had it felt quite like this. This was not the playful boo of an unruly fan. It was disdain, raw and public. A second shout followed, closer to the stage. "You're not the king anymore." This time the words triggered a ripple of laughter from a cluster of men near the middle rows. Their suits looked expensive, but their expressions were sneering. The hall's air grew tight. Then the sound came, piercing, deliberate, whistles of disapproval. First from a small group, then from others emboldened by the safety of numbers. The noise rose and fell like a wave, breaking the fragile sense of civility. On stage, Elvis adjusted the microphone. The faint click of its stand echoed in the silence that briefly followed the whistles, magnifying the smallest sound. A glass toppled somewhere in the back, shattering, and even that seemed to underline the tension. Half a dozen people stood up from their tables, coats in hand, their departure loud in its intention. They moved down the aisle, shoes striking the floor with a rhythm that felt rehearsed, as if they wanted each step to be a statement. The remaining guests leaned away to let them pass, whispering into their drinks, avoiding eye contact with the man under the lights. From the front row came the voice that would later make the papers. A red-faced man, emboldened by whiskey and attention, leaned forward and shouted, "You're finished, Presley, finished!" The microphone, too sensitive, caught the phrase and amplified it so that every corner of the room heard. The sound ricocheted through the speakers, cruel and unavoidable. For the first time that evening, Elvis broke the rhythm. His hand, halfway to a chord, froze. His foot pressed against the stage monitor, holding him steady as he raised his head. The guitar strings hummed faintly from the aborted motion, then went still. The room's noise collapsed into silence. The protesters, smug seconds earlier, now sat back, uncertain. Cameras set up along the side of the hall pivoted slightly, zooming in. The tension was so sharp that the audience could hear the faint buzz of the amplifiers, the rustle of napkins against plates, the hum of the overhead lights. Elvis let the quiet stretch. His gaze moved across the faces in the crowd, faces that glared, faces that avoided his eyes, and faces that waited to see whether he would stumble. For a long heartbeat, the entire hall hung suspended on his decision. And yet there was no anger in him. His expression was steady, almost gentle, though beneath the surface his body carried the pressure of years. It would have been easy to lash out, to answer words with words. Instead, he stood absolutely still, as if listening for something only he could hear. A woman near the back shifted in her seat, embarrassed at the silence. The veteran in the front row gripped his crutch more tightly, his jaw set. Children who had been restless just moments earlier leaned against their parents, their eyes fixed on the man in the white suit who seemed to hold the room hostage without saying a word. The organizers, watching from the wings, were pale. One whispered, "He's going to walk off. God help us, he's going to leave." Another shook his head, praying the equipment wouldn't fail, praying the cameras weren't capturing what might be the collapse of the night. Still Elvis waited. His right boot tapped once against the wooden floor, sharp, audible, final. Then, silence again. It was not the pause of a man defeated, but of a man measuring his next breath with care. The crowd leaned forward instinctively, pulled in by the stillness. The jeers had dried up, the courage of the hecklers vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. No one wanted to be the next voice against him. The hall was no longer hostile noise. It was pure suspense. In that fragile balance, it seemed the concert might shatter before it had even begun. One wrong word, one forced smile, and the night would dissolve into scandal. Instead, Elvis lowered his gaze to the guitar resting against his chest, then lifted his head again. His eyes were not pleading, nor proud. They were searching, steady, patient. The silence grew unbearable. Every person in the room knew something was coming. They simply did not know what. And then, without warning, he stopped strumming altogether. His hands dropped to his sides, the guitar silent against his body. He stepped closer to the microphone, his shadow falling across the first row. The hush was absolute. It was clear. He would not answer insult with insult. He would answer with something else. The night had reached its breaking point. What followed would either restore him or destroy him. The silence stretched so long it felt eternal. Then, instead of resuming the polished show his managers had prepared, Elvis tilted the microphone with a deliberate slowness. The band, waiting for their cue, froze in uncertainty. His hands didn't return to the guitar strings. Instead, he closed his eyes for a breath and opened them again with a decision already made. He began to sing without accompaniment. No instruments, no beat. Just his voice cutting through the charged air like a blade through cloth. The song was unexpected, unlisted, unapproved. If I Can Dream. The choice startled everyone. It was the anthem from his 1968 comeback, a song soaked in longing, protest, and hope. Written when America seemed to be bleeding from every wound at once. Back then it had been daring. Tonight it was incendiary. The first line floated into the hall, raw and unembellished. The sound engineers exchanged frantic looks. This wasn't in the program. Their levels weren't balanced for a cappella. One even reached toward the control board, only to pull his hand back, realizing to interfere would be to ruin a moment already taking shape. At first, the crowd seemed almost offended by the audacity. A man whispered to his wife, "What's he doing?" But the room's protest quieted as quickly as it had risen. The power of the voice was undeniable. It wasn't slick, wasn't polished. It was cracked in places, but those cracks made it human. The spotlight glinted off the sweat beginning to form along his brow as he held each note longer than rehearsed, daring the silence to interrupt him. He squeezed the microphone as if grounding himself, knuckles pale against the chrome. In the second row, a waitress carrying a tray of drinks stopped mid-step, her eyes fixed. The glasses clinked softly as her hands trembled. Somewhere near the back, a child's toy clattered to the ground. No one turned to pick it up. Then came the shift. The chorus. His voice climbed higher, his chest heaving with the effort. And as he reached the peak, something extraordinary happened. The room, once hostile, froze in reverence. A veteran in dress blues, rigid moments earlier, bowed his head. His wife pressed her hand against her mouth to stop the sob that threatened. Another man, seated near the front, clenched the edge of the table so hard his knuckles whitened. Cameras positioned at the side aisles caught the wetness forming in eyes that moments earlier had been narrowed with judgment. The room was still, utterly still, so silent that the accidental slip of a fork from a dinner plate seemed deafening, followed by the sharp intake of breath from its embarrassed owner. Elvis didn't stop. He leaned into the microphone, pushing his voice into the rafters as though he were trying to lift the ceiling off the building itself. Each word seemed less like lyrics and more like confession. By the time he reached the final refrain, his body shook with the strain of holding the last note. He opened his mouth wide, eyes locked upward, and from somewhere deep inside came a cry that was not just music. It was the sum of every slight, every insult, every burden he had carried. For a heartbeat, the sound was unbearable in its intensity. Then, as the note faded, the silence returned. But this silence was different. It was not hostile, it was sacred. The cameras zoomed close. They caught a man in uniform wiping his eyes. They caught a woman clutching her husband's arm, lips moving silently to words she remembered from another time. And they caught Elvis, standing alone, sweat dripping, chest rising and falling, staring out not with arrogance, but with something closer to vulnerability. A glass slipped from someone's hand near the bar and shattered against the floor. No one reacted. No one even looked away from the stage. Children in the audience, restless only minutes before, now sat motionless. Their wide eyes locked on the figure who, without a guitar or orchestra, held the room in complete surrender. From the wings, the organizers stood in disbelief. One muttered, "This wasn't supposed to happen." Another whispered back, "And yet it's happening." The song ended, but the silence clung to the room, stubborn and thick. It was the silence not of rejection, but of awe. Elvis lowered the microphone slowly, his hand trembling only slightly. He didn't smile. He didn't bow. He just breathed, long and heavy, as if carrying the weight of what he had just laid bare. The veteran in the front row with the missing leg shifted forward, his eyes locked on Elvis with an intensity that cut deeper than words. His jaw trembled, but his gaze held steady. What had begun as a hostile spectacle had turned, in those minutes, into something no one could have scripted. And though the hall did not yet erupt, though applause had not yet broken the spell, everyone knew the night had changed. The applause did not come immediately, but the atmosphere inside the hall had shifted beyond recognition. A room that had bristled with suspicion now sat stunned, as though no one dared move. Yet while the crowd wrestled with its silence, chaos erupted behind the stage. In the narrow corridors of the Civic Center, organizers and staff darted back and forth, their faces pale, their words sharp. Clipboards rattled, headsets buzzed with frantic voices. For them, the concert had veered off the rails. The careful program, designed to reassure sponsors, to keep the evening polite and profitable, was gone. In its place was something unpredictable, something dangerous. A man in a tailored gray suit, one of the evening's principal donors, pressed through the crowd of assistants until he stood inches from the stage manager. His voice dripped with controlled fury. "If he keeps this up, I'm pulling my money. I didn't pay for a sermon. I paid for a show." His words struck like a gavel. Several staffers froze, uncertain whether to placate him or defend the performer who had just silenced a hostile crowd with nothing but a voice. The manager wiped his forehead, muttering under his breath, "God, this isn't what we promised." He shoved a notepad into an assistant's hands. "Get word to the sound booth. Push him back into the program. We can't lose this man's check." In a smaller dressing room nearby, a young promoter, barely in his 20s, jacket too large for his frame, hovered at the doorway, waiting for Elvis to step off stage. The boy's face was flushed, his lips trembling as he rehearsed the words he had been ordered to deliver. When Elvis finally walked into the corridor, sweat running down his temple, the promoter straightened, blocking his path. "Mr. Presley," he stammered. "Sir, you need to get back to the set list. They're saying the concert's about to collapse if you don't. Please, you have to go back to what was planned." His voice cracked, the desperation plain. Elvis paused, towering over the boy, not with menace, but with a calm gravity. He smiled faintly, a slow curve of the lips that was more gentle than dismissive. "Son," he said quietly, "a song can be worth more than a program." The promoter swallowed hard, unsure whether to argue. Before he could speak, another figure approached. Colonel Parker, Elvis's longtime manager. His face was red, his tie loosened, his eyes darting like a gambler who had just lost his bet. "Elvis, listen to me," Parker hissed. "You're playing with fire. These people didn't come for politics. They came for a performance. Do you want this to be your last charity show? Because it will be." Elvis turned toward him, still breathing heavily from the stage lights, his chest rising and falling with effort. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I'm not here for a show, Colonel. I'm here for people." The words were simple, almost offhand, but they cut through the hallway with the clarity of a rifle shot. Assistants stopped mid-step. The young promoter blinked in disbelief. Even the angry donor paused, as though unsure he had heard correctly. Elvis brushed past them, walking slowly but firmly toward the stage entrance again. His presence carried a weight that silenced further protests. Behind him, the staff muttered, arguments tangled with fear. "He's going to ruin us. Or save us. I can't tell anymore." The corridor smelled of dust and overheated wiring. Every door seemed to tremble with the sound of the restless crowd waiting. Yet Elvis looked almost serene, his face set not in defiance, but in conviction. For years, he had lived inside schedules, inside contracts, inside expectations dictated by others. But tonight, with every jeer he had endured, with every note he had just sung, something had shifted. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he was not the puppet of a program. He was the author of the moment. A runner sprinted past, clutching a message for the production crew. "Switch back to the band, prepare the next track." But the urgency of the staff no longer matched the man who walked with unhurried steps back toward the stage. He had already made his choice. At the wings, an organizer tugged at his sleeve. "Mr. Presley, I beg you, just give them the Vegas Act. That's what they paid for." Elvis stopped, resting his hand on the heavy velvet curtain that separated him from the hall. His eyes softened, but his tone stayed firm. "They didn't pay for Vegas. They paid for hope, even if they don't know it yet." The organizer fell silent, his protest dying on his lips. The stage lights glowed through the fabric, warm and blinding. Elvis drew in a deep breath, steady as stone. Behind him, panic still buzzed. Ahead of him, a crowd still simmered between skepticism and surrender. And with that, he pushed the curtain aside, stepping back into the blaze of light, not as a performer bound to a script, but as a man resolved to give what his heart demanded, no matter the cost. When the curtain opened again, the room seemed to brace itself. The audience expected the return of sequins, spotlights, and the usual spectacle. Instead, Elvis stepped out carrying nothing but an acoustic guitar. No brass section, no orchestra swell, no dramatic entrance. He walked calmly to the center, pulled a chair forward, and sat down with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man who had already decided the night would not belong to convention. The murmurs began at once. "What's this?" someone whispered. Others leaned forward, puzzled. The band members looked at one another, uncertain whether to follow or stay silent. Elvis gave them no cue. He rested the guitar on his thigh, plucked a quiet chord to test the tuning, and then leaned toward the microphone. His voice carried a softness that contrasted sharply with the storm that had unfolded earlier. "We're here tonight for something good," he said, his eyes sweeping across the faces. "Not for me, not for a program, for each other, for people who need us." His words were not rehearsed. They came haltingly, but they carried a sincerity that could not be mistaken. He strummed a gentle progression and began a hymn he had not performed in years. Peace in the Valley. At first, confusion rippled through the crowd. A gospel number? At a charity gala meant for donors and politicians. But the purity of the melody settled quickly into the room. His voice, lower now, carried the weight of prayer rather than performance. A woman near the center clasped her hands together, mouthing the words in quiet recognition. An older man, hardened and skeptical, glanced around as though embarrassed to be moved, then bowed his head. The hymn, born in small churches and kitchens, found its way into the grand hall with the same intimacy it carried in country chapels. Slowly, others began to sing, first in scattered whispers, then louder, their voices finding courage in one another. It was uneven, imperfect, but it was genuine. The hall transformed from an arena of doubt into a gathering of shared song. Halfway through, a crackle sounded through the speakers. One of the microphones flickered, then died altogether with a dull pop. Gasps rose. The technicians swore under their breath, scrambling at the control board. For a moment, disaster loomed again. But Elvis did not falter. He kept strumming, leaning closer, singing louder without amplification. His voice carried on its own strength, unpolished but unwavering. Then something remarkable happened. The audience filled the silence. From the back rows to the front tables, men and women picked up the words, carrying them where the machines had failed. The hall became a choir, hundreds of voices rising, some broken, some strong, yet together forming a wall of sound that dwarfed anything microphones could produce. The cameras kept rolling. One lens caught a boy in the balcony singing with eyes closed, his father's hand resting on his shoulder. Another caught a group of veterans, their medals glinting faintly as they sang through tears. Elvis smiled, not wide, not for show, but a small, grateful curve of the lips. He strummed softer, letting the audience lead, his own voice blending into theirs. It was no longer a performance, it was communion. By the final verse, nearly every seat was empty of silence. Even those who had jeered earlier found themselves swept into the tide of melody, compelled by the sincerity that had taken root. The hall trembled with unity, the kind of moment that could never be manufactured. When the last chord faded, there was no immediate applause. The room sat in reverent quiet, as though no one wanted to shatter what had been created. Then, slowly at first, hands came together. A ripple of clapping built into a wave, rising until the hall roared, not with mockery, not with cynicism, but with something closer to gratitude. The technicians, defeated but astonished, lowered their hands from the useless equipment. "We lost him," one muttered. But somehow he carried the whole damn hall. Elvis set the guitar down across his knees, his fingers lingering on the wood. His chest rose and fell with deep breaths. He looked out into the sea of faces, faces no longer cold or mocking, but alight with something fragile, something honest. He had gambled everything on this turn, and against every expectation, the risk had not collapsed the night. It had redefined it. The final notes of Peace in the Valley still lingered in the rafters when the audience rose to its feet in a slow, uneven wave. The hall that had bristled with jeers earlier now thundered with applause. For many, the transformation felt surreal. How had they gone from contempt to reverence in less than an hour? Yet not every face was convinced. In the shadows of the back rows, arms stayed folded, lips pressed tight. Skepticism clung to some corners like smoke that refused to clear. Elvis remained seated on the chair, the guitar resting quietly against his leg. He did not revel in the cheers, nor did he rush to silence them. He simply let the applause flow over him. his gaze wandering across the room as though searching for something deeper. Then, movement in the front row shifted the atmosphere again. A man in uniform, decorated but weary, rose slowly from his seat. The hall's roar subsided at once. The spotlight caught him as he leaned heavily on his crutch and began to walk toward the stage. His left leg was gone from the knee down. The hollow thump of the crutch against the floor echoed like a drumbeat, each strike pulling the air tighter. Murmurs filled the silence. Some feared confrontation. After all, veterans had been among the harshest critics of Elvis, accusing him of shirking duty while others bled overseas. The cameras swung to capture the man's approach, reporters scribbling in their pads even before he reached the stage. Elvis stood, his body taut but calm, waiting. The veteran stopped at the base of the stage, close enough for their eyes to meet. His face was worn, his jaw trembling with effort. In his hand, glinting faintly under the lights, was a medal. The veteran raised it high, his voice rough with emotion. "This should belong to you." A collective gasp swept the hall. No one moved. The words struck harder than any insult shouted earlier. Slowly, with great care, the man extended the medal toward the singer. Elvis descended a step, his hand steady as he accepted it. He did not smile. His eyes glistened. His lips pressed tightly as he bowed his head in respect. Then, without a word, he walked back to the microphone stand and placed the medal gently across its base, letting it hang in plain view for everyone to see. For a heartbeat, silence ruled again. And then the dam broke. The hall erupted, not in polite applause, but in something feral, something uncontainable. People clapped until their palms burned. Others shouted his name with unashamed pride. Some who had left earlier returned from the lobby, drawn by the roar, and froze in disbelief as they saw the sight of Elvis standing tall, the medal gleaming at his feet. The cameras caught tears streaming down faces. Old men who had sworn never to forgive him, young women who had doubted his relevance, even children who could not fully understand but felt the weight of the moment. Elvis lifted the guitar again, his fingers brushing the strings as though testing whether the spell would hold. His voice carried into the chaos, calm and steady. "Let's keep this going." Without waiting, he launched into a song not listed on the program, a ballad that spoke of home, loss, and redemption. The crowd quieted instantly, leaning in. His voice was tired but strong, his delivery stripped of spectacle, every syllable born of lived experience. The medal swung gently with each vibration of the microphone stand, catching the light, a silent reminder of the bridge just built between the stage and the audience. By the final verse, the applause no longer waited for silence. It swelled between lines, people unable to contain themselves. Standing ovations rippled like waves until nearly every person was on their feet, hands raised, faces open. The reporters who had prepared harsh columns glanced at one another, crossing out notes, starting again from scratch. They scribbled frantically, their pens chasing the momentum they knew would be history by morning. In the wings, the organizers stared in disbelief. The businessman who had threatened to cut funding stood rigid, his jaw slack. One whispered to another, "We just witnessed it." The night turned. Elvis strummed the last chord and let it hang, unmoving. The applause surged louder, rolling over him like thunder. He placed his hand over the medal for a brief second, then looked into the crowd, not with triumph, but with gratitude. The night that had begun as a battlefield of boos had now become something entirely different, a communion of voices, a reconciliation of doubt. And yet, even in this triumph, there remained the shadow of resistance. Not everyone was ready to forgive, not everyone willing to be moved. But the balance had shifted irreversibly. The man they had tried to dismiss had seized their disbelief and turned it into reverence. The concert was no longer entertainment. It had become testimony. The ovation still rattled the rafters when a disturbance stirred behind the curtains. Amid the cables, stagehands, and exhausted organizers, a new figure emerged. Tall, suited, his expression carved with political caution. A senator, well known in the region, had been sitting quietly among the donors all evening. Now he pushed his way toward the stage entrance, his aide trailing close behind. His voice cut through the din, low but insistent. "This has gone too far. End it before it turns into a rally." The organizers stiffened. They had worked for months to secure his backing, to keep the gala above reproach. To alienate him would mean not only the loss of funding, but the risk of headlines branding the night as scandal. The stage manager, pale as parchment, whispered to his assistant, "Signal him. Make him stop after this song. For God's sake, stop him." From the wings, frantic gestures waved toward Elvis, hands slicing across throats, palms pushing downward in the universal command to cut short. He noticed them, of course. His eyes flickered briefly to the side of the stage, catching their signals in the corner of his vision. For a moment, the crowd, still roaring, was unaware of the battle being waged in the shadows. But Elvis knew. He saw the senator's sharp suit, the organizers' panic, the fear of losing money and influence. He understood exactly what they wanted: to rein him back into the box, to smother what had just been ignited. Instead of stopping, he set his guitar aside and stepped toward the microphone. His hands gripped the stand, his posture upright, his expression steady. The hall began to quiet, sensing something unscripted. "I'm being told," he said slowly, his drawl measured, "that I should finish now, that we've gone far enough." The audience shifted uneasily, unsure what he would do next. "But I want you to hear me plain. I'm not here for politics. I'm not here to stir a crowd. I'm here for the ones who've lost, the ones who've bled, and the ones who still believe there's more to us than hate." The words landed with the weight of stone. Murmurs spread like fire. A woman near the back clapped her hands together in defiance of the silence. A man shouted, "Sing it, Elvis," and others echoed in approval. Yet not all were pleased. Some shook their heads, muttering about recklessness, about irresponsibility. The senator folded his arms, his lips a thin, disapproving line. His aide scribbled furiously on a notepad, no doubt crafting a statement for the morning papers. But Elvis stood unwavering, his voice now rising above the murmurs. "I've spent years being told what to sing, what to wear, what to say, and maybe some of you think that's all I am, a costume, a show. But tonight, I'm giving you what I believe, and if that's too much, well, I reckon I'll live with it." The hall exploded in applause, louder and fiercer than before. Some rose to their feet again, cheering not just the music, but the audacity of defiance. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the defiant tilt of his head, the conviction etched across his sweat-lined face. Not everyone clapped. A handful of donors at the side tables gathered their coats, rising stiffly, their disgust plain. They whispered to one another as they walked out, their departure a silent protest. But their absence was swallowed by the roar of those who stayed. The organizers looked helpless, caught between fury and awe. The young promoter who had begged Elvis earlier to stick to the program now stared at him with wide eyes, his lips parted as if witnessing something he couldn't yet name. Elvis stood in the center of the storm, not triumphant, not angry, just resolved. His words had drawn a line in the sand. Some would despise him for it, others would never forget it. For the audience it was clear. This was no longer a fundraiser. This was something larger, a moment where entertainment gave way to testimony. And though the risk to his career, his reputation, even his finances loomed heavy, Elvis had chosen to walk into that risk with open eyes. The cameras kept rolling, documenting every flicker of resistance and every surge of devotion. The night had become more than performance. It had become declaration. The hall was still vibrating from his words when Elvis returned to the microphone. The donors who had left were gone. The senator glared in the shadows, but the audience, what remained of it, was alive in a way no one had predicted. It was no longer the polite crowd of a charity gala. It had become a congregation, restless, eager, leaning forward as though bracing for revelation. Elvis took a long breath. He did not glance at the organizers nor at the cameras. His eyes were set far away, as if searching for a sound only he could hear. Then he picked up the guitar again, plucked a few slow chords, and began a piece few expected him to attempt. An American trilogy. The opening was delicate, almost tentative, a whisper of a Southern hymn. A few in the crowd gasped in recognition. The choice was bold, even reckless. It was a song that stitched together three fragments of America: the lullaby of the South, the sorrow of enslaved voices, and the triumphant cry of the Republic. To some it was a contradiction. To others, it was the very essence of reconciliation. The first verse unfolded like a prayer. Elvis's voice was quiet, steady, yet heavy with history. The hall fell silent once more, every cough and shuffle swallowed by the gravity of the music. Then the second movement surged, the melody shifting into the mournful rhythm of spiritual lament. His tone grew darker, chest deep, pulling every ear toward him. It was as if centuries of grief flowed through that one voice. The audience was transfixed. Veterans straightened in their seats, hands pressed to their chests. African-American families near the back leaned forward, their eyes glistening. Donors who had dismissed him earlier now sat stiff, caught in a performance they could not ignore. Then the final section erupted. With a sudden sweep of chords, Elvis's voice soared into the Battle Hymn of the Republic. The transition was electric, shocking in its power. The audience, startled, rose almost as one. Some saluted, others cried out. Many simply stood with hands clasped, overwhelmed. The stage lights blazed hotter, the sweat pouring down his face and soaking his collar. His body shook as he pushed his voice to its highest register, giving every ounce of breath he had left. His hand struck the strings with fury, the guitar itself trembling as though it could barely withstand the force. Cameras swung wildly, catching close-ups of faces in the audience. A young woman mouthing every word, tears streaking her cheeks. An elderly man with a cane, his eyes closed, lips moving silently in prayer. Children on their chairs, reaching their hands upward as though pulled by invisible cords. The sound was no longer confined to the stage. It poured into every corner, through every beam and tile, until the building itself seemed to tremble under the weight of it. The jeers and cynicism of the evening were gone, replaced by a chorus of voices rising to meet him. First a handful sang along, then dozens, then hundreds, until the entire hall was engulfed in one thunderous, unified refrain. Elvis tilted his head back, eyes closed, his mouth open wide in the final cry of the hymn. The note seemed endless, carrying the weight of his country, his life, and his redemption. His hand struck the final chord like a hammer, sharp and resonant. The sound crashed into silence. For a heartbeat, the hall was still, stunned by what it had just endured. Then the eruption came, applause so fierce it shook the walls. Whistles piercing, cheers cascading like waves. People leapt to their feet, pounding their hands together, shouting until their throats burned. It was not polite applause. It was catharsis. The cameras recorded it all. Elvis drenched in sweat, his chest heaving, his hands trembling but unbroken. The medal still hung from the microphone stand, catching the flood of light like a beacon. The ovation did not stop. It went on and on, minutes stretching into eternity. Some cried openly, strangers embracing strangers. Others waved their hands in the air, shouting his name. Even those who had once doubted now clapped until their palms reddened. Elvis bowed his head, exhausted, his lips moving silently in thanks. For a rare moment, he seemed not like a performer at all, but a vessel, someone through whom something larger had just passed. The night had reached its peak. The audience, fractured at the start, had become one voice. The man they had once scorned had lifted them into a moment of shared transcendence. And for Elvis, standing alone in the spotlight, drenched and trembling. It was clear. This was not just a concert. This was absolution. The hall still roared long after the final chord, but behind the curtain the atmosphere was strikingly different. Elvis staggered into the shadows, drenched in sweat, his hair clinging to his forehead, his chest rising and falling like a man who had just fought a battle. His aides rushed toward him with towels and water, but he waved them off gently, still caught in the spell of what had happened. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the organizers who had spent the night wringing their hands, terrified of collapse, stood motionless, their faces pale and stunned. The colonel tugged nervously at his cigar, his mouth open as though searching for a reprimand. But the words never came. He knew, as did everyone in that corridor, that the evening had slipped beyond their control and into history. Reporters poured into the backstage area, their typewriters carried in leather cases, notepads flapping in their hands. They had come ready to carve his obituary as an entertainer, to report the scandal of a fading star who had been booed off stage. But what they had witnessed forced them to rip pages from their pads and begin again. A young journalist, her hands trembling, whispered to a colleague, "I had an entire column written before he sang. Now I don't know how to start over." The answer came from across the room. Start with the truth. They tried to bury him. Instead, he resurrected the room. Elvis collapsed into a chair, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. His eyes were distant, his hands still trembling faintly. He seemed not victorious, but emptied, as if every ounce of himself had been poured into the hall. A runner appeared at his side, thrusting a sheet of paper from the front office. "Mr. Presley, donations are flooding in. The phones won't stop ringing." Another voice added, breathless, "We've already doubled the target, and it's still climbing." He nodded faintly, but said nothing. Numbers meant little in that moment. What stayed with him was the sound of thousands of voices that had once jeered, now singing as one. Out front, the transformation was complete. Guests who had left in anger returned to find strangers embracing, men and women openly weeping, children tugging at their parents' sleeves to ask what they had just witnessed. The bar was deserted. Untouched glasses left sweating on tables. People lingered not for drinks or gossip, but simply to stay in the presence of what had unfolded. The veteran who had given Elvis his medal was surrounded by reporters. When asked why he had done it, he answered with rough simplicity, "Because he gave something back to us tonight, and I wanted him to know we saw it." By morning, newspapers across the country carried headlines few could have predicted. They booed him. He answered with a song, and America wept. Another paper wrote, "From jeers to tears, Presley's night of redemption." Even critics who had dismissed him for years admitted they had underestimated his resilience. Editorials marveled not at his costume or his fame, but at the raw humanity of what he had delivered. The footage replayed on television in the days that followed. Elvis beginning a cappella, the medal gleaming on the stand, the hall erupting in thunderous unity. For many, it became less about music than about a memory of collective catharsis. Letters poured into the organizer's office from people who had not even attended but had seen the broadcast. Strangers wrote of how the performance reminded them of church revivals, of wartime bonds, of hope they thought they had lost. In the quiet of his hotel room afterward, Elvis finally let the silence settle. He sat near the window, the city lights flickering below, the medal resting on the dresser. He stared at it for a long while, then reached out and touched it with reverent fingers. The weight was small, yet the meaning was immense. He whispered to himself, "It wasn't about me tonight, it was about them." The promoters calculated record-breaking donations. The colonel schemed how to spin the moment into contracts and tours. The newspapers scrambled to adjust their narratives, but none of that touched the essence of the night. For those who had been there, and even for those who only saw it secondhand, what remained was the memory of a man who refused to bend to cynicism, who answered hate with vulnerability, who sang not for glory, but for truth. The legend of Elvis Presley had always been tied to the image of the boy from Tupelo, the rebel who shook his hips and changed music forever. But that night, his legend took on another shape. Not as a provocateur, not as a fading star clawing for attention, but as a man who walked into a storm of hostility and emerged with dignity, unarmed except for his voice. In the years that followed, people would argue about the meaning of that concert. Some called it his greatest comeback, others dismissed it as a lucky accident. But for those who were in that room, for the veterans who wept, the families who sang, the donors who found themselves moved against their will, there was no debate. It was a night when division gave way to unity, if only for a song. And so the story lived on, not of sequins or screaming fans, but of a hall that began in scorn and ended in rapture, and of a singer who proved that the truest comebacks are not staged for cameras. They are born in the crucible of doubt, when one voice dares to rise against silence.